30,000 feet above Germany. The air is thin enough to kill you, cold enough to freeze blood in the guns. A B-17 takes a 20-millimeter cannon shell through the nose. The plexiglass shatters. Wind screams through the cockpit at 200 miles per hour. The bombardier is gone. Just gone. Another shell rips through the No. 3 engine. Fire blooms orange against the white sky. The propeller seizes. Metal shrieks. The pilot doesn't turn back. He can't feel his hands. His co-pilot is slumped against the controls, semi-conscious. Behind him, the waist gunners are screaming into the intercom, but the words are lost in static and wind. The plane shudders, rolls left, begins to drop. And still, somehow, it flies. How many hits can a machine take before it stops being a machine and becomes a coffin? The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't supposed to answer that question. But over the skies of Europe, it did, again, and again, and again. This isn't a story about invincibility. It's a story about something far stranger. The B-17 Flying Fortress became a legend not because it couldn't be hit, it was hit constantly, but because it refused to die. Crews brought them home with engines missing, tails shredded, fuselages torn open like tin cans. Planes that by every law of physics and aerodynamics should have become tumbling coffins at 25,000 feet. But they didn't. And for 70 years, we've celebrated the myth. The unbreakable bomber, the flying tank, the fortress in the sky. What we haven't asked is how. Not the obvious how, the armor, the guns, the firepower. But the hidden how. The design secrets buried in engineering blueprints. The crew improvisations that never made it into official reports. The psychological warfare that made the B-17 more than just a machine. This is the story of what kept the Flying Fortress in the air when everything else said it should fall. And by the end, you'll understand why the most important survival feature was the one nobody saw. August 1943. The 8th Air Force is bleeding. Every mission over occupied Europe costs bombers. Dozens of them. The math is brutal. 10 plane formations go out, 7 come back, then 5. The life expectancy of a B-17 crew is 15 missions. They're required to fly 25. The strategic situation is simple and unforgiving. Germany's industrial heart, the ball bearing factories, the oil refineries, the aircraft plants, sits deep inside the Reich, beyond the range of any fighter escort. To destroy those targets, American bombers have to fly alone, in broad daylight, through the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The Luftwaffe knows they're coming. Flak batteries know the altitude. Fighters know the routes. It's not war, it's a firing gallery, and the B-17 is the target. But here's what doesn't make sense. The losses, catastrophic as they are, should be worse. Far worse. Luftwaffe pilots report firing bursts that should have shredded bombers into scrap. Flak gunners claim direct hits that should have vaporized entire formations. Intelligence officers on both sides are confused. The Flying Fortress is absorbing punishment no aircraft was designed to survive. American command doesn't fully understand it yet. They know the B-17 is tough. 4 engines, heavy armor, 13 50 caliber machine guns. But toughness doesn't explain what's happening. Toughness doesn't explain bombers landing with control surfaces missing, hydraulics destroyed, entire sections of fuselage gone. The Germans have a theory. American engineering is better than expected. The armor is thicker. The structural design is superior. They're wrong. If this question matters to you, mark it now. Back to the story. The real answer is something else entirely. Something that begins not with what the B-17 was built to do, but with what it was never supposed to survive. Much like the Bell P-39 era Cobra, a fighter America discarded as a pea shooter, until Soviet pilots discovered its true potential in a role it was never designed for. The B-17's greatest strengths emerged not from the drawing board, but from the moment crews learned to exploit what the designers had accidentally created. By autumn, the pattern is undeniable. Missions are flown, fortresses are shredded, and somehow, impossibly, they keep coming home. The Luftwaffe begins to suspect they're fighting something they don't understand. They're right. October 10th, 1943. Mission to Münster. 300 B-17s form up over England before dawn. The plan is simple. Fly 400 miles into Germany, drop ordnance on the railway marshalling yards, turn around, fly home. 6 hours in enemy airspace. The bombers climb to 27,000 feet. At this altitude, the outside temperature is 50 below zero. Oxygen masks freeze to faces. Machine guns jam if the oil isn't thin enough. At 0920 hours, the first Luftwaffe fighters appear. Focke-Wulf 1980s. Dozens of them. They don't attack from behind, too many guns. Instead, they come head-on, diving out of the sun at 400 miles per hour, closing the distance in seconds. Cannon fire rips through the formation. A B-17 named Banshee takes hits across the nose. The bombardier's station disintegrates. Plexiglass, metal, and body parts vanish into the slipstream. Wind pressure inside the fuselage becomes so violent it rips maps off the navigator's table. The pilot, Captain Richard Morse, can barely see. Ice forms instantly on the inside of the shattered windscreen. His co-pilot is wrestling the controls, trying to hold altitude. They don't abort. Here's why. The B-17's fuel tanks are self-sealing. Rubber liners inside each tank automatically swell and close when punctured. A single innovation designed by engineers at Firestone that transforms a death sentence into a survivable wound. Fighters could punch holes through the wings all day. The fuel wouldn't ignite, wouldn't leak fast enough to matter. Banshee stays in formation. At 0947 hours, a second wave hits. This time, flak. The sky turns black with bursts. Shrapnel tears through aluminum like paper. A B-17 called Hell's Angels takes a direct hit to the No. 2 engine. The cowling explodes. Fire erupts. The propeller windmills uselessly, then seizes. Standard procedure: feather the prop, shut down fuel to that engine, keep flying. But there's more. The same burst shreds the hydraulic lines. No hydraulics means no brakes, no flaps, no bomb bay doors. The plane is still flyable, but landing will be suicide. The flight engineer, Staff Sergeant William Kozlowski, doesn't wait for orders. He crawls into the bomb bay, unpressurized, wind screaming, temperature 60 below, and manually cranks the doors open, one at a time, by hand. Takes him 18 minutes. The bombs drop. The weight drops. The plane climbs 500 feet. Hell's Angels stays in formation. 10-15 hours. The formation reaches Münster. Flak is now continuous. The sky is a wall of black smoke and orange fire. Every burst sends shrapnel in a 200-foot radius. Pilots hold course, steady, level, predictable, so the bombardiers can line up their targets. This is when bombers die. A fortress named Lucky Strike takes 3 hits in 4 seconds. One through the tail, severing elevator cables. One through the radio room, killing the operator instantly. One through the right wing, rupturing the fuel tank. The self-sealing works. The fire doesn't start. But the tail is gone. Not damaged, gone. Everything aft of the waist gunner position is shredded aluminum and exposed framework. By every aerodynamic principle, the plane should spiral. It doesn't. What saved Lucky Strike that day wasn't armor or firepower. It was something the designers never meant to be a weapon at all. Something invisible. Here's the secret. The B-17 was designed with distributed control systems, redundant cables, backup hydraulics. If the primary elevator cable snaps, there's a secondary. If that snaps, the trim tabs can still adjust pitch. Pilots learn, mid-flight, mid-crisis, that they can fly the plane with throttle adjustments alone. Increase power on one side, decrease on the other, and the bomber turns. Lieutenant Daniel Kovac, piloting Lucky Strike, doesn't know this yet, but his co-pilot does. He's been in the Air Corps for 2 years. He's seen this before. "Power controls," he shouts over the intercom. "Use the engines." Kovac adjusts throttle. The plane shudders, steadies, holds. No training manual covered this.
If Kovac miscalculated,
If the engines stalled, if the trim tabs failed, the plane would roll inverted and kill everyone inside in under 3 seconds. He doesn't miscalculate. Lucky Strike stays in formation. And then everything changed. 10:32 hours. Bombs away. The formation turns west, heading home. The flak stops. The fighters return. This is the worst part. The bombers are lighter now, faster, but also more vulnerable. No bombs means no weight pressing down on the wings. The planes are easier to throw off course. Messerschmitt 109s attack from above. They've learned not to engage the nose guns or the tail. Instead, they target the belly, the ball turret, where one man sits in a plexiglass sphere with 2 50 caliber guns and almost no armor. A burst of 20mm fire hits the ball turret of a B-17 named Big Time Operator. The gunner, Sergeant Harold Bauer, takes shrapnel through his left leg and shoulder. The turret's hand crank jams. He's stuck, can't rotate, can't elevate, can't get out. The plane is losing altitude. Hydraulics are failing. The pilot gives the order, prepare to bail out. But Bauer can't. The turret is jammed shut. If the crew bails, he dies. If they ditch in the ocean, he drowns. The waist gunners don't bail. They crawl down into the turret housing, pry open the manual release with a crowbar, and haul Bauer out by his harness. It takes 11 minutes. By the time they're done, the bomber is at 9,000 feet and dropping. The pilot levels off at 4,000. Barely enough altitude to glide to the English coast. Big Time Operator lands on one engine, no hydraulics, no brakes. It skids off the runway into the grass and stops 20 feet from a fuel depot. Bauer survives. So does the crew. By 1400 hours, the remnants of the mission return to England. Of the 300 bombers that left that morning, 47 don't come back. Another 60 are so damaged they'll never fly again. If this moment landed with you, acknowledge it. Remember the men who didn't return. But 193 made it home. Ground crews walk the flight line, documenting damage. They find holes you could fit a man through, engines hanging by 2 bolts, tail sections held together by cables and prayer, wings with 6 feet of aluminum simply missing. One crew chief counts over 200 flak holes in a single plane. The bomber flew for 3 hours like that. This is when the Allied command begins to understand. The B-17 isn't surviving because it's stronger. It's surviving because it's redundant. Every critical system has a backup. Every structural element shares the load. But there's something else, something deeper. What kept these bombers alive wasn't what held them together. It was the emptiness between the pieces. You can destroy half the plane and the other half will compensate. It's not a fortress, it's a living thing. An organism that refuses to die because no single wound is fatal. The Luftwaffe sees the same data and reaches a different conclusion. They need bigger guns. They're solving the wrong problem. Because the real secret, what kept those bombers flying, wasn't in the blueprints at all. It was in the men. By the winter of 1943, the strategic calculus has shifted. The Luftwaffe throws everything at the bomber streams: cannon pods, air-to-air rockets, ramming attacks. But the loss rates don't improve enough. For every 10 B-17s shot down, 100 make it through. The factories get hit. The oil refineries burn. The ball-bearing plants go offline. Germany's war production begins to crack. But the real impact isn't industrial, it's psychological. Every mission, German civilians learned the sound. 4 Wright Cyclone engines before dawn. Then the black smoke of flak batteries firing blind into clouds. Then, hours later, the same formations returning west, slower, trailing smoke, but still flying. The Luftwaffe claimed victories. The civilians saw ghosts that wouldn't die. The sight became proof. American power wasn't just strong, it was inevitable. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence begins studying what went right. They interview pilots, engineers, ground crews. They pull data from thousands of missions. Patterns emerge. The bombers that survived weren't always the ones that took less damage. They were the ones whose crews adapted fastest. The engineer who bypassed a failed system. The gunner who manually cranked a turret. The pilot who learned to fly with throttles instead of control surfaces. The plane was resilient by design, but the crews made it unkillable. This realization changes everything. Training programs are rewritten. Crews are taught not just to fly the B-17, but to repair it mid-flight. Engineers design quick access panels. Mechanics create field manuals for jury-rigging hydraulics with spare cable and duct tape. The B-17 evolves in real time. Not on the factory floor, in the air, under fire, at 25,000 feet. By the spring of 1944, a strange thing happens. Crew survival rates improve even as German defenses intensify. The bombers are still getting shredded. The difference is they're staying airborne long enough to reach friendly territory.
The Luftwaffe has better pilots now, better tactics, better guns. It doesn't matter.
They're fighting an aircraft that learns. But here's what history often misses. The B-17's legendary toughness created a hidden cost. Because crews believed the plane could take any hit and survive, they sometimes stayed in formation longer than they should have. Took risks that got them killed. The myth of invincibility became its own kind of trap. Hundreds of bombers that could have turned back, that should have turned back, pressed on and were lost. The fortress that wouldn't fall sometimes fell anyway. Not because it was weak, but because its reputation convinced men they were invincible. They weren't.
If you love real World War II stories that sound unbelievable but actually happened, stories where the engineering is just as dramatic as the battle, subscribe for more. Because the war didn't just happen on the front lines. It happened in design labs, repair depots, and freezing bomb bays where men fought physics and won. The legacy endures. Modern military aircraft still use redundant systems, self-sealing fuel tanks, distributed structural loads, all innovations refined or proven by the B-17. The plane didn't just survive the war, it shaped every bomber that came after. But the deeper truth, the one that matters, it's not in the blueprints. Here's what the engineers never advertised. The B-17 wasn't designed to be a flying tank. It was designed to be light. In the original specifications, before the war, before anyone knew what strategic bombing would actually look like, Boeing built the B-17 to carry heavy payloads over long distances. That meant minimizing weight everywhere possible. Thin aluminum skin, open framework, minimal armor. The fortress myth came later. When the first combat reports came back from Europe, Boeing and the Army Air Forces started adding armor plating behind the pilots, reinforced turrets, additional guns. They turned a light, fast bomber into something heavier, slower, more protected. But here's the paradox. The survivability didn't come from what they added. It came from what they couldn't remove. The original lightweight design meant the B-17's structure was a skeleton, not a shell. Force distributed across the frame instead of concentrating in any single point. When a shell tore through the fuselage, it punched a hole and kept going. The surrounding structure absorbed almost nothing.
The plane flexed, bent, held. A more armored bomber, denser, more rigid, would have shattered. The B-17 survived because it was empty in all the right places. The redundant systems, the backup cables, the distributed controls, those were intentional. Boeing built in backups because early test flights revealed how fragile long-range bombers could be. But the structural resilience, that was an accident, a side effect of trying to save weight. The Germans never figured this out. They kept building bigger guns, heavier cannons, thinking the problem was penetration. They could punch through the armor, they did, constantly, but it didn't matter. The holes didn't kill the plane. The B-17's greatest strength was its weakness, weaponized. And the crews who brought them home? They succeeded not because they trusted the machine, but because they didn't. They knew every backup system, every manual override, every way to keep flying when the automatic systems failed. The plane gave them options. The men made the choices. 70 years later, you can still find them. B-17s in museums, parked behind velvet ropes, polished to a shine they never had in wartime. People walk around them, touch the aluminum, count the gun positions. They see a fortress, but that's not what it was. If someone in your family flew, fixed, or faced these machines, say where they served, it was a frame held together by cables and luck, and men who refused to let it fall. It survived not because it was unbreakable, but because breaking it didn't matter. The holes didn't ground it. The fire didn't stop it. The wounds didn't kill it. But the secret that kept them flying? It wasn't what the engineers built into the plane. It was what they left out. The empty space, the flex, the room for failure, and the crews who learned to fly through the gaps. The B-17 wasn't unkillable. It was ungroundable. There's a difference. Next time, the fighter America threw away. The one Stalin's pilots turned into a weapon that terrified the Luftwaffe. The Bell P-39 Airacobra. Why America's pea shooter became deadly in ways no one expected.